Okay. Good evening, everyone. As we're in the home stretch, coming up to Purim. So last week was sort of like the downside of Purim. The discussion of Haman, the Russia, and the whole concept of Amalek, and and the difficulties that the Jews had. So this week we're going to talk about, thank God, the upside as we move towards at least a partial geula, a redemption that isn't complete, but at least they got saved from being killed, even though they still lived. Most of the Jews were still living in the exile, and we didn't gain any freedom, so to speak. But our situation improved greatly, and we're very thankful for that situation. So there is a custom on Purim, which will be Friday for most people, but for those few of us who live in ancient walled cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, for those few people like us, we'll be doing this more. We'll read this psalm on Shabbat, but again on Sunday. And the psalm is Psalm 22. And Psalm 22, which according to the Vilna Gaon is actually the psalm of the day for Purim. Most people that recite this psalm say the regular daily psalm and just add this. According to the Vilna Gaon, this actually replaces the psalm of the day. And that poem begins with the following words. Lamanatseach al Ayelet Hashachar, Mizmor LeDavid. Lamanatseach, the Menatseach, it says here for the leader, that means like the concert master. The word Menatseach is the person who conducts the choir or the orchestra so quite often you don't see for the leader, sometimes you see it translated for the conductor. Okay, maybe you're on a train too. No, not that kind of conductor. You see that people, for the person who leads the musical musical presentation, that's the Menatseach. Al Ayelet Shachar. Now, I have in front of us on the sheet the translation of the Jewish Publication Society, and they chickened out. They didn't put a translation. They just took the words Ayelet Shachar and transliterated them into English letters. A Psalm of David, Mizmor, a musical psalm of David. In Hebrew, the word for a song, music, is zemer. When we talk about a shir, in Hebrew, really that's the lyrics, the poem. So a shir is really a poem, and a zemer is really the music. So it's Mizmor LeDavid, a musical poem of David. Now that's a problem, as we're going to see as we go along, because a lot of people say that this poem refers to Esther and the Purim story, which of course is a problem because King David was at least 5 centuries before the Purim story takes place. But I mean, maybe it's there's the interpretations are very broad. Sometimes you can say David predicted, had prophecy about things that would happen in the future. And other people say that no, it really was written closer to the time of the miracle of Purim, but they wrote it in the style of David. And that's why it is a psalm not by David, but it's a psalm of David in terms of its format. Either way, it's a beautiful psalm. But we have to first understand what's going on with this term, Ayelet Shachar. So the Radak, David Kimchi, writing in the 13th century, gives a number of interpretations for what we mean by this double term, Ayelet Shachar. And we're going to be spending approximately the first half of tonight's class talking about this phrase, at least until 8. Here we go. There are those who say, and he's letting us know that it's Rashi and many others, that Ayelet HaShachar, those two words, which can be translated as a hind or a deer of the morning deer. Now, this idea about having morning deer is, it's not talking about a fleishig breakfast, having a morning deer. That's not what they mean. What's fascinating about a number of gazelles and deer are only visible early morning and around sunset. The rest of the time, they're basically in hiding in, usually in, grassy, tree-filled areas. And when we go to Teaneck, and I go to Teaneck, New Jersey, visiting Rivka's family, and I go to Shul early in the morning, along the way, I almost always see a family or two of deer that are out in the morning. But by the time I get back from Shul, and you're into the morning, they're hiding wherever they are. And you maybe see them again in the evening. So this idea of a hind or a deer coming out in the morning could be a description of this phenomenon of we tend to see deer and gazelles walking around in the morning and we don't see them during the day. Okay, no one says that, but I figured I would just add it in. But Rashi says that the term Ayelet HaShachar, which means a hind or a deer of the morning, he says that's a musical instrument. And doesn't have anything to do with any story or Purim or anything else. It's just the name of a musical instrument that made a very pleasant sound. What makes sense about that is that quite often in the beginning of a psalm, they'll talk about some of either the type of music that's going to be played or some of the instruments that might be used. So we have no idea what this musical instrument called Ayelet HaShachar is, but Rashi and others believe that that's what we're referring to in this introduction. Okay, we're now going to ignore that approach. There are also interpreters who explain Ayelet meaning my sakor, my strength, okay? Because it means to do things both fast, like quick as a deer, swift as a deer, but also with power and with determination. So again, later in the poem, in for 20, which means the 20th verse toward the end of the poem, haste thee to help me. Please rush like a deer with power and force and alacrity to help me out. Meaning that this psalm was uttered in the strength of the morning's dawn. That King David wrote this when the dawn was coming, and that Ayelet HaShachar could also be a reference to the morning, which is what we're now going to say. And some interpret Ayelet as the name of the morning star. Now, the morning star is in Hebrew called Noga, and the morning star is almost always Venus. Once in a while, you can see Mars in the morning, but usually, most of the time, when you see a star at the same time as sunrise, it's almost always that the brightest of the phenomena in the sky, which is the planet Venus, which here they're calling a star, but okay. So therefore, we have the words of our rabbis, and we're going to go more deeply into what the rabbi said in the next of our Torah, but we'll say it quickly here. They call the morning star Ayelet. And we'll see why in a few minutes. Some also interpret it of David while he was still a fugitive from Saul. So he is running away from Saul, and he refers to himself as the gazelle or the deer of the morning, running away from Saul, Shaul HaMelech, who wanted to capture him. However, after those attempts to describe it, the correct view is that the title, The Hind of the Morning, means the congregation of Israel while in this exile. That it refers to our situation. We are like the Ayelet Shachar during this time of Galut. And the end of the psalm proves this. It calls her a hind, again, a deer, just as the comparison is applied to her in the Song of Songs, among the roes or among the hinds of the field. And if you remember the end of the poem, Song of Songs, the last line is talking about the beloved deer running away over the hills. So it could be a reference to us that in Galut, we're like deer, spending most of our time hiding, but always afraid. Deer, when you see them, they're beautiful, but they're afraid of everything. Make some noise or come close to them, they just run away. And that's the way we are in Galut. We have this sense of unrest, of upset, that we're constantly on guard for bad guys out to get us. We only live in confidence when we're here in Eretz Yisrael. The meaning also of Hashachar, the morning, is beauty and brightness. The morning air, the morning feel, the rising sun is just full of beauty and optimism. It's like the opposite of sunset. Sunset gives you this sense, perhaps, of dread and fear, even though it might also be beautiful. As it says concerning her, who is she that looketh forth as the morning? And now she is in darkness in this exile, as if forgotten and abandoned, and she cries out from exile. So it could be many of these interpretations, but the one that mostly gets used is that Ayelet the Shachar is a reference to Esther and the story of Purim. And we're going to begin to see that in this famous Yerushalmi, which is a famous story. It appears in the Yerushalmi, as I brought it down here, but there are other versions of the story that are slightly different in a number of midrashim and collections of rabbinic statements. And the story goes like this. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. So these are Tanaim during one of the wars against the Romans. Was Rabbi Chia alive in the first war when the temple was destroyed, or was it the Bar Kokhba war? Nobody's entirely sure, but there was a lot of fighting in the Arbel area. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever climbed the Arbel. It's a beautiful cliff overlooking the Kinneret just north of Tiberias. And there are caves all along the walls of the valley below the cliff where Jews hid from the Romans, mostly in the first war against the Romans, 68, 69 of the Common Era, just before the temple was destroyed in 70. So it could be a reference to that war, that he and Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta were walking through this beautiful valley between two high mountains, cliffs on either side. If they kept walking, by the way, straight for like 5 kilometers, they'd end up at Kibbutz Levi. So if that's the area just north of Tveria. So they're walking along. Before morning, because they're worried about the Romans. They don't want to get captured, so they're moving in the darkness. And then they see Ayelet Shachar, which you see gets translated in this Sefaria translation of the Gemara as the morning hind, the morning deer, that started radiating. So they're in this valley, which is going starts very low and starts going up towards the plateau where Kibbutz Levi is. And as they're going up, there's the beginning of the morning coming. It must have been beautiful. And the great Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, "O great man," they were very respectful to each other, "O great man, so will be the deliverance of Israel." It starts off very small. It's like you're looking at the horizon and you're not quite sure. Is that the sun rising? Is that the beginning of the day? And that's how Geula will come. It will start off with a tiny little light. Starts out very small and grows and then radiates as it goes on. The Torah Tamima commenting on this, that's Baruch Halevi Epstein, that's the TT there. The Torah Tamima says, that is to say that the Galut is like the darkness and Geula is like the light. For this reason, we have the custom to read Baruch Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you, O God, who has redeemed Israel. The minhag originally was to read that just as the sun was rising. You'd say Ga'al Yisrael, you'd see the first light on the horizon, and then you'd start your Shmona Esrei. And it makes us feel like we are experiencing the Geula, the redemption, which is like that light coming to pierce the darkness of our troubles and exile. So that is indeed the custom, and that's what the Ayelet HaShachar is, and that's what Rabbi Chia is talking about. Now, nowadays, very few people, there are people that daven Vasikin and do try to time Ga'al Yisrael sunrise, but most of the time we daven inside, and we daven based on clocks, not based upon the natural phenomena around us, which is a little sad, but that's the way it is. So it starts little by little, continually grows. So too, the Geula of Israel at all times. We should be able, in our present difficulties, to see a way out, to see a light at the end of the tunnel, to see the beginning of the Geula. Maybe it's coming, and we should be looking for it all the time, is what the Torah Tamima is explaining, what Rabbi Chia meant. What is the reason? What is the reason that it comes so slowly? When he shall dwell in darkness, the eternal is my light. When you dwell in darkness, exile, galut, difficulty, our light comes from Hashem, and we compare that to the morning sunrise. So also at the start, Mordechai was sitting at the king's gate. In other words, Mordechai came to the attention of the king at the end of chapter 2 of the Megillah. We're not introduced to Haman until chapter 3. So the beginning of the Geula is when Haman has to pull the horse that Mordechai is on when we get to chapter 6 later on in the Megillah. But the reason that Mordechai was getting that reward was because of the story of these two court officers that wanted to assassinate the king by giving him poison, Bigtan and Teresh. So in other words, the beginning of the Geula, the beginning of Mordechai coming to the attention of the king and later being rewarded for it, happened before Haman comes on the scene. In Yiddish, they say, "Der refuah fer damaka," that the beginning of the cure, salvation, started even before the trouble started. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu places little hints and little helps for the Jewish people even before the Jews realize that they are indeed in trouble. So at the start, Mordechai was sitting in the king's gate. See, here's about the plot to kill the king, comes to the attention of the king, and will be rewarded later. After that, Mordechai returned to the king's gate. After that, Haman took the garment and the horse. It was the introduction of when Haman begins his downfall and Mordechai and the Jews begin their success. And after that, Mordechai left the king's presence in royal garb. And after that, the Jews had light and joy. In other words, there are 4 steps to the Geula, according to Rabbi Chia. You don't have to agree with this position. And according to him, all 4 steps have to do with Mordechai. So according to Rabbi Chia, in this famous, beautiful story about the sunrise in the Arbel Valley, the first step was Mordechai uncovers the plot to assassinate the king. Number 2, later, Haman will have to lead his horse through the streets. Number 3, after Esther unmasks the villain, after that, Mordechai is given new clothes and he leaves the palace of the king as a ruler, semi-ruler, as viceroy to the Persian Empire. And then comes the pasuk, which we'll get to on the backside of the sheet. La Yehudim hayata ora v'simcha v'sason vikar. And the Jews had light and joy. 4 steps. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Now, the Torah Temima that I quoted a little bit from before, talking about this Gemara, is elucidating some of the things we just talked about. He explained the experience based on the sitting of Mordechai in the gate of the king when he revealed the plot of Bigtan and Teresh. His insight was similar to their Ayelat HaShachar. When it just begins to burst forth, it's a tiny light that just grows and grows and grows until it's a massive fireball of the sun. That this incident was the beginning of the cure for the coming troubles. The refuah, the cure, fear before the makkah, the troubles, the difficulties. Furthermore, this incident was before Haman encountered Mordechai in the street of the city, as the bad times hadn't started yet. Which can also be compared to, furthermore, it's like Mordechai emerging from the king's presence in chapter 8. The say Mordechai Melifnei Amelech, and we talk about all the wonderful clothing he's wearing, which can also be compared to the emerging sunlight over the land, which happens at the end of sunrise. Then the Jews had light similar to the full sunshine at midday. Notice that our sages who say that Psalm 22 is about Esther, since it's written there also, Keli, Keli, Lama Azavtani is verse 2 of that poem. I didn't put it on the page. I think a couple of years ago we did talk about that verse. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because according to tradition, that's what Esther said when she was waiting to see if the king would reach out the sharvit, his royal scepter, to let her come in to the throne room. And so the whole poem has references that we use vis-a-vis Purim. However, in Tractate Yoma, it explains that Esther was herself like the Ayelat HaShachar. So as both verses can be applied to Esther HaMalka. Why doesn't the text in Yoma also compare the Geula to Ayelat HaShachar? Because this phenomenon was similar in every Geula. So we're not unique to Purim. So, okay, so why we're not so interested. But our Gemara in the Yerushalmi is really getting us ready for the redemption. Okay, and the redemption has 4 steps. One more comment about the verse about Ayelat HaShachar before we turn to the famous verse in the Megillah about Purim is from Kol HaTor. Now, Kol HaTor is a Rabbi Hillel Rivlin. Rabbi Rivlin was very interesting. Rabbi Rivlin was a student of the Vilna Gaon. And before the Vilna Gaon died in 1798, he told Rabbi Rivlin and a number of other students, but one of his chief students was Rabbi Rivlin, and he told them, you should make Aliyah. And so it was. 5 years later, starting in 1803, the first Ashkenazic Jews living in Yerushalayim, because before that, the community was totally Sephardic in Yerushalayim, were Talmidei Hagra, and they're called the Yishuv Hayashan, the old settlement. And they were the first Ashkenazim living in Yerushalayim in modern times. I guess ever, because in the ancient times, there weren't Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Anyways, the first Ashkenazim living in Yerushalayim were led by Rabbi Rivlin. Fast forward 7 generations, and his great grandson is Ruby Rivlin, who was the previous president of Israel. And that family has been in Yerushalayim. They're now in their 10th generation living here in Yerushalayim, the Rivlin family. So he commented on, again, our pasuk about Ayelet the Shachar, and he said, the first rays of light before the dawn. In this psalm, we find, Keli, Keli, lama avdanu, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which was the prayer of Queen Esther, who was from the line of Mashiach ben Yosef. In other words, Mordechai was from the tribe of Binyamin, but we believe that Esther was from the tribe of Ephraim. And so she had in her genes Yosef HaTzadik, and there is going to be a precursor to Mashiach ben David, to the real Messiah. There's going to be someone who leads us to that point, who's Mashiach ben Yosef. Our sages said that the redemption of Israel will come about like the first rays of light before the dawn. They are referring to the beginning of the redemption, which was the mission of Mashiach ben Yosef. There's going to be someone who's going to pave the way, and that's the beginning of the light. But the full light will only come with sunrise and the Mashiach ben David. They were referring to the beginning of the redemption, the mission of Mashiach ben Yosef. In connection with this, as an additional explanation, they also noted and referred to the mystery of Jacob's blessing of Naphtali, who is compared to the hind, the swift animal who is let loose. This is in the line of Mashiach ben Yosef from the firstborn of his ox, which explained by the Vilna Gaon in his commentary in Habakkuk. Okay, we're not going to go into that, but again, it's the beginning of the Geula. So somehow these commentaries, the Torah Tamima and a little bit before him, the Kol HaTorah, Rabbi Rivlin, believe that somehow we can see the seeds of the future redemption in the situation of Purim, because maybe the Geula will actually start outside of Israel and then move its way to here. We don't know, but that's a speculation that exists. But again, the 4th verse, according to Rabbi Chia Hagadol, the great Rabbi Chia, the 4th verse, the 4th step in the redemptive process from Purim is La Yehudim Hayata Ora V'Simcha V'Sason V'Ikar. The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness and honor. And of course, this is the 3rd of the psukim that we say out loud when the Megillah is being read. And I shouldn't say almost most of the time, I say, La Yehudim Hayata Ora V'Simcha V'Sason, and I can't stop myself. I say, Kainti Elanu. This is how we should be fast, because it's like that's why I'm used to saying it from Havdalah. So sometimes I'm there, and whenever I do this, there's always somebody near me who looks at me like, you idiot. What are you going to do? But I feel like saying, Kainti Elanu, yeah, let's get it too. We want it, and we want it now. So anyways, based on this, Rav Steinsaltz said, for the Jews, there was light, joy, gladness, honor. Instead of the bloody pogrom that had been planned, in which they were not meant to have any right to self-defense whatsoever, They were now legally permitted to protect themselves, fight their enemies, and Baruch Hashem win. So that's what the verse is really talking about. They were joyous over the fact that Achashverosh gave them the right to defend themselves. That's pshat. But that's not the way the rabbis look at the verse. They look at it very differently from that literal meaning that Rav Steinsaltz just referred to. And we see the famous interpretation of the verse from the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. And again, the verse states the Jews had light and gladness, ora v'simcha, joy and honor, sason vikar. Rav Yehuda said, so this is the most famous way of interpreting our verse. I'm going to try my hand at giving you another interpretation in about 10 minutes. So he said light represents the Torah. Now that makes sense because we have a famous pasuk, ki ner mitzvah v'torah or. For the mitzvah is a lamp and the Torah is the light. Ki ner mitzvah v'torah or. So we see the first thing the Jews celebrated with was Torah. So what do they mean by Torah? So some people say it means the Jews reaccepted kimu v'kiblu masha kiblu kva. They reaccepted the entirety of the Torah. Well, other people say it means the Megillah. That the Torah that's talking about means the Megillah that we read, which is the Torah, the scriptural material describing the events. But whichever one it means, it's still the first step in their joy was Torah study, because that's who we are. We are eternally students of the Torah. Gladness. So what's the simcha? This refers to festivals, chagim, because we say, v'samachta b'chagecha. On your holidays, on your festivals, you should be happy. Now, what is happiness? I'm not going to give you people write books on what is happiness. So I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. The rabbis say that happiness is ein simcha ela b'basar v'yayin. Joy only takes place with meals that are made from meat and wine. And of course, based on that idea, we're supposed to have fleshig meals on holidays, and there is the minhag that the Seudah on Purim should also be a fleshig meal. Now, I'm saying this because that's what most of the commentaries say. However, Rabbi Soloveitchik was asked the question in Boston many, many years ago, probably in 1968, 1969, on a Saturday night, someone said, what do I do? I'm a vegetarian, which was less common in the 60s than it is today. And the Rav said, you have to interpret that famous rabbinic statement, Ein Simcha El B'Basar V'Yayin, to the foods that you like. If you find yourself repulsed by a certain foodstuff, that cannot bring you joy. So it's perfectly okay if you, again, are a vegetarian or are in some way repulsed by the idea of eating meat, to have something else. You can have a lasagna and enjoy yourself. Whatever it might be, you can have tofu burgers. I don't know, whatever. Although I shouldn't make fun of this. Once a week, Rivka and I have cheeseburgers. No, we have these paref hamburgers, and they're delicious. I mean, and the new ones, there's actually like liquid coming out. You feel like you're really eating hamburgers, and then we put some cheese on it too. So we have keilu cheeseburgers, but so you can replace meat if that's your predilection. But you should eat at a Seudah for a Chag or for the Seudah of Purim, food that you consider to really make you happy, and that's the simcha. Okay, the next one. is joy. So what gives us joy? And so the Gemara says joy is Brit Milah, that people really like a Brit Milah. Now, it's interesting about Brit Milah. I don't want to belabor this, but Brit Milah is one of the few personal simchas that affects positively the entire community. There is a minhag that if a Brit Milah is going to take place in a shul, that shul does not say Tachanun that day, even if no one from the shul is going to go, because the simcha, the joy of a Brit Milah is somehow shared by the entire community. Now, I had a friend as I was becoming religious in the 60s who had lived in Vilna, Mr. Kosovsky, very, very nice man. And he told me that in Lithuania, normally when you went to like a bar mitzvah or a wedding, you only said Mazal Tov to the Balei Simcha, to the bar mitzvah boy, to his parents, or at a wedding, to the bride, the groom, the parents. You didn't say Mazal Tov to like everybody at the affair, except for a Brit Milah. When there was a Brit Milah, you said Mazal Tov to everybody in the crowd, which I thought was a fascinating custom. And it fits in with what we're saying here, that simcha of a Brit Milah, Jews coming into the Brit, into the covenant, accepting the Torah and Judaism, is joy for us all. And that's what happens in Shushan. Kimu v'kiblu. The Jews reaccepted the Torah. So that's as if they were undergoing a new Brit Milah. There's actually a midrash that says that a lot of people hadn't gotten Brit Milah for various reasons, and they got their Brit Milah after the Purim story, which is also a beautiful idea. And the last one in it is vikar, honor, and this is referring to tefillin. Now, what about tefillin? Now, I feel bad because women don't wear tefillin generally, although we know halachically and historically there were some women that wore tefillin. But tefillin is supposed to give us a sense of feeling importance. In the morning, when we say the morning blessings, there's a minhag when you get to the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Oter Yisrael b'tifara, that God crowns the Jews with glory. There's a custom to touch your tefillin shorosh, because the tefillin is like a crown, giving us a sense of importance and glory. So those are the four things. Okay? Ora, Torah. Simcha is Chagim. Sason is what was it? What was Sason? Oh, is Brit Milah, is circumcision. Sorry about that. And Vikar is Tefillin. So those are the four joyous levels that we discuss. Okay, but going further in that verse, Shnei Luchot HaBrit. This is Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, who lived in Tveria. We're keeping our references up north today, right near the Arbel. So he wrote, our joy on Purim achieves harmony of body and soul. That's a beautiful idea, that we believe that what's supposed to happen in a true joyous Jewish event, that it sustains both our neshama and our guf. There's a physical and a spiritual aspect to true joy. Our sages saw this in the words, La Yehudim Hayata Ora, that they had Torah and Sason joy. They accepted the Torah voluntarily. Torah is good for both body and soul. It has revealed and hidden meanings. It has stuff you can just read and say, wow, this is fascinating. But the more you study, the more you discover. And there are many, many levels below the literal level that you begin with. The Torah contains elements that address themselves to the spheres of action and meditation. Shnei Luchot of Brit, of course, himself, Rabbi Horowitz, was a mystic, and he believed in meditation. Haman intended to wipe out the Jews bodily and spiritually. How do we know that? This is why the book of Esther describes his plan as a dual one, lahashmid ulahareg. He wants to destroy and kill. Why both? Very simple. The word lahashmid alludes to destruction of the Jews as a spiritual force in the world, whereas ulahareg refers to the physical destruction of the Jews. A real anti-Semite doesn't just want to physically kill us. He also wants to destroy the ideas of Torah and Judaism. Those demonstrations, on campuses all over America and in all the major cities in Europe, they weren't just trying to, denigrate the Jews and denigrate Israel. They also want to wipe out Torah and everything good that we stand for. And that's why the Purim event is supposed to include both spiritual happiness, hearing the Megillah, giving charity, as well as physical enjoyment, which is eating the meal and sharing food with friends. So we're trying on Purim to cover both bases with tremendous amount of devotion and joy. Okay, the last idea on the page before I share something outside with you, the Sfat Emet, the Gira Rebbe. The animosity of Amalek is against the Torah. The primary goal of the true anti-Semite, the primary goal is to destroy the Torah, to kill everything that we stand for. As he said to Achashverosh, the first thing he says to him, then bad. He doesn't say they're bad people. He doesn't say they're nasty people. Doesn't say, they deserve it because they're crooks and criminals. No, their religion is different. Therefore, after the downfall of Haman, the Jews reaccepted the Torah. The Jews saw that what Haman hated in them was their Torah, their mitzvot, their philosophy, their way of life. And then they saw, well, God saved us. We're not only going to appreciate the salvation physically, we're going to go back and study Torah. It was only then that they achieved the full joy, as it is written. And again, back to our verse that we've been talking about. For the Jews, there was light. All this is written after the hanging of Haman. Haman is hanged at the end of chapter 7. In chapter 8 is when King Ahasuerus gives Mordechai the signet ring, showing that he is the new viceroy. And then Mordechai gets the beautiful garments that show his power and his status in society. And then comes our pasuk, but we have to get rid of Haman first. And this is just like in the desert. The Jews fought Amalek at the end of Parshat B'Shalach. We got rid of Amalek before in Parshat Yisro we can accept the Torah. First we get rid of Haman / Amalek, then we get Torah. So we see that the essence of the joy was in their merit to receive anew the Torah and to magnify God's name in the world. Now, of course, this is a little ironic, that part of the purpose of accepting the Torah all over again was to magnify God's name in the world. The irony is God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah. So even though the purpose of it all is lahagdil et Hashem v'Torato, to magnify God and his Torah, it's a little ironic that his name is mentioned, but that's a topic for another time. And this ultimately resulting in the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, it was under the Persians, under Cyrus, Koresh, the Great, who gave us permission and also helped to finance the second Beit HaMikdash, which is the spreading of God's name in the world. So what the Sfat Emet is saying, what the Rebbe is saying is, first we take down Haman, then Mordechai becomes important, then we re-accept the Torah, and then we rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. It's all in the wake of the destruction of the evil of Haman / Amalek, which is the spreading of God's name in the world and God's delight in the Jews. We say mystically that somehow God enjoys the avodah, the divine service in the temple, since the evil ones bring darkness and prevent God's name from being complete. So getting rid of Amalek means there's room for Hashem in this world. Israel reveals its full kedusha by eradicating Amalek. Our true sanctity is shown when we get rid of those roadblocks to studying Torah and to having Torah. Therefore, a verse says, Hayatah, it was with the destruction of Haman, there's now light and gladness, happiness and honor. Only now. We couldn't have it in the shadow of Amalek / Haman. Through the destruction of Amalek, there emerges the full potential of the Jewish people. The four levels that Yehudim, the four levels, Ora, Simcha, Sason, Vikar, light, gladness, happiness, and honor, the four levels that Yehudim are able to achieve only after subduing the klipa, the negative aspects of Amalek. Now, I'm going to say something that that I feel funny saying because I've never seen anybody say it. But when going through this material, it just struck me, and I think it's true that this pasuk, which the Gemara says is talking about, it's talking about the Torah, and it's talking about Yontiv, and it's talking about Brit Milah, and it's talking about Tefillin, but it could be talking about another four-part major issue. I think that that when we look at the holiday, just like the Sfat Emet says, there were 4 steps to the great stuff happening. The elevation of Mordechai, okay, Esther's power over the king, okay. Then of course we have the great joy of the holiday and the happiness and the Jews coming back and recommitting to Torah and mitzvah. I really think that the 4 mitzvot of the day are hinted at in this 4-term verse. The Ora is the reading of the Torah of Purim, the Megillah. The Simcha, just like on Yontiv, Ein Simcha el b'basar v'yayin, joy is only expressed in wonderful meals. The Simcha is the Seudah. The Sason, the joy, I believe, is Mishloach Manot, Ish L'Reyehu, that we send gifts of food to people. It makes them happy and it spreads my joy. I'm happy and I make them happy. By the way, whenever I give Shlach Manot in our building, there are some little kids upstairs, and I give each of them their own Shlach Manot rather than giving it to the family. They're so happy. It's like, it's not the calories, it's the idea that they're being recognized. And we giving these gifts to people just makes them feel good. And the vikar, this effort at trying to spread honor, that's matanot le'evyonim. Because we want even those people who normally aren't able to feel good about themselves, to for at least one day a year feel good about themselves. I've got some money in my pocket. I can go and buy myself something. So the 4 levels are called by the rabbis, Torah and Yontiv and Brit Milah and Tefillin, and all that's wonderful and true. But I think the day itself has built into it these 4 levels. So the simcha again is the reading the Megillah. Ein simcha el Torah. The sason is the ora. Ein or el Torah. The ora, the light, is the Megillah. The simcha is the Suda. The sason is sending gifts, mishloach mano ish l'reyu, and the yakar is matanot le'evyonim. So we are built into the day, fulfilling the 4 levels that are supposed to exist in a spiritual life. And in the spiritual life, there must be, is there some relation to the 4 cups of wine at the Seder? Good question, Gail. And I think you could say as a drasha, but generally we say that the 4 cups of wine at the Seder are based upon the 4 terms of Geula. Now, you could say that the 4 levels of Geula represented in the verses at the beginning of Ve'era, Ve'hotzeti, Ve'etzalti, Ve'lakachti, all those verses, Ve'heveti, all those 4 verses could be fit into this scenario, I believe. I don't think that's a stretch. On the other hand, halachically, the reason for the 4 cups is that there are 4 mitzvot during the night that require us to have a cup. There's this Kiddush, there's the Megillah, there's the Haggadah, and then there's Birchat Hamazon, and then there are the Psalms at the end that each one of them carries a Kos Yeshuot, a cup of victory. But you could make that point that the 4 levels are present in the Seder as well. It's an idea worth pursuing. But I think that as we read the Megillah and think about the experience and go through all of the mitzvot of the day, hopefully each one of those mitzvot gives us this sense of light and gladness, happiness and honor. And I just hope that we all achieve that in our own Purims. And I just hope that everybody here has a freilichen Purim, a joyous, wonderful Purim. And maybe over the next couple of days, our wars will end and we'll really have reason to celebrate. I remember in 1991, on Purim was when the ceasefire happened in the first Gulf War. And everybody in Israel, we had been hit with 39 Scud missiles by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And everybody was joyous, and it happened on Purim. Hopefully this year we'll have the same phenomenon, that we will, end our state of war on Purim, which is a very appropriate time for this to finally happen in our continuing problems in the modern Jewish world. Okay, everybody should have a wonderful Purim, and thank you all for joining this evening. Purim Sameach L'Kulam.
Thank you to you, Rabbi. Purim Sameach.